How nice. Thank you. That's great. Huh? I'll be in it, but I love it. Oh, thanks. And this too? Wow.
Did Cindy give you the bagel list? She was going to give you the bagel list, did she?
Oh, no, she didn't.
That's okay.
But I'll get
That's
it from
okay.
her for next time.
Yeah. Okay, because I have some things to fill in on it before we pass it around again.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe I should have Cindy call you?
I'll call her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you know she's here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah, I sent a note and she wrote me back when she was here. Yeah.
And you know they're putting together a tribute for Nina. Did you know that?
Yes.
Are you involved?
Yes.
Yeah, so am I.
It's hard to do.
Well,
I wanted to say something that not everybody else is saying, because everybody's going to say she was remarkable, she did this, she did that, and I maybe approach it a little.
I'm going to talk about her at poetry and read her poem.
Oh, that's great.
The one that she read to us.
Yeah. I might talk about how we grew up together and what our common life was.
Nobody else can talk about how you grew up with her.
Since kindergarten.
Oh, really? How about that?
But I don't remember her then.
She was an amazing person. I mean, she was very much into herself, that's for sure. But she...
And yeah, I got a little annoyed with this business of the video, because it's just another one of those things.
Right.
She drove away a lot of people with that. It's a shame because she did so much time.
Oh, didn't she, though? Oh, yes. Right. All right, we'll call Cindy and we'll put this together.
Yes.
As you say, it's overdone.
We should go out to meetings at 6 in the morning. Joey, you can just from the floor. Did you read this? I did.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Didn't mean to interrupt the buzz that's going around in the room, but so nice to see all of you. Let's see now. So thank you to Jackie Weiner for sponsoring bagels, and Barbara Kuby for sponsoring streaming, and Joan Levy for picking up the bagels today. Thank you so much. So welcome also to those of you who are live streaming. I hear from several of you from time to time, so I'm glad that you are tuning in. Just one brief programming announcement. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, Rabbi Dadun is going to be talking about Louis Brandeis in the Warhol series. We did Kafka last week. Several are upcoming, including the Marx Brothers later in February. But I know that Rabbi Dadun would love to have you with her. So tomorrow in the chapel at 3 o'clock. Malcolm?
A shameless promotion for an upcoming concert at Temple-Tifereth with Apollo's Fire in the end of March. I think the performance is on a Saturday here with a program to include music of both the Jewish and African diasporas. And someone suggested it features our own Jeffrey Strauss.
Right, exactly. Very good. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And Malcolm, you said end of March. Is that what?
Yes.
The exact date? Yeah, we'll mention it when it gets closer as well. Okay, blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. So we're today beginning the Torah portion known as Bo, the word that means in Hebrew to come into Pharaoh. We're in chapter 10 of Exodus and dealing with the last 3 plagues. So we're about to reach the climax, or one of the climaxes of this story. So one of the things that has always interested me is what happens right at the beginning of chapter 10. So let's begin it. Chapter 10 of Exodus. Somebody have the page in the Jewish Publication Society? Kathy, you have?
98.
98. Very good. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these my signs among them, and that you may recount in the hearing of your sons and your sons' sons how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am the Lord." So when we think of the book of Exodus, and really this feature figures throughout the historical narratives of the Bible, we're really dealing with a kind of dualism, a binary opposition between the Israelites and others, the Israelites and the enemies of the Israelites. And it's quite clear that we're dealing with, if you'll allow me to put it this way, a mythic struggle that is larger than history, that is a struggle between, let's call it, 2 individuals who are thought of as gods. Pharaoh says about himself, and we know this about ancient Egypt, that the Pharaoh was seen as a god. And I think it's in chapter 5 of Exodus that Pharaoh says to Moses, "Who is this God of yours?" So we might see this as a struggle between claimants to the throne of being God. And that's why the struggle in the book of Exodus is so protracted, so lengthened, takes such a long time to work through. Another author might have had the victory of the Israelites and the Israelites' God through one plague. One plague might have been enough. Let's start with the sacrifice, the slaughter of the firstborn. Plague 1, end of the story. But that's not what the author did. The author elaborates for hundreds and hundreds of words in order to magnify the struggle and to show that really neither Pharaoh nor any other claimant to being God is God. That God has displayed God's uniqueness and singularity. And therefore, the right to claim obedience from God's charges. What gives God a right to say to people at Mount Sinai, "You shall do X, you shall do Y"? The question can be raised, why? What gives you the right to cause us to be obligated? And the answer is, in the decisive and definitive victory that God had over the Egyptians, the greatest empire of the day. So we're not only dealing with the book of Exodus in a kind of mythic struggle between 2 powers, but also in a very binary way. Let's put it this way. Good guys and bad guys. Those who get it right and those who get it wrong. And the bad guys are, let me put it hyperbolically, really bad. And the Pharaoh is really bad. And we are really good. And this continues throughout the wilderness wandering, and then when they arrive in the promised land, and they have to deal with the Canaanites and the Philistines, and so on and so on. So I always or regularly think of the Bible as a kind of dialectical text. And by dialectic, which has itself that concept, a big, long history in the history of philosophy, I think of dialectic as the conversation between the yes and the no. Yes, we are the good guys. Yes, they are the bad guys. But wait a minute, maybe we need to make this a bit more problematic than that. So look what happens in verse, I guess it's verse 2. And that let's start again. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I've hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these my signs among them, and that then for you to tell the story. You may recount in the hearing of your sons and your sons' sons how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I displayed my signs among them." Binary. I'm going to hurt them, you're going to tell the story as victors. But notice how the verse ends. In order that you may know that I am the Lord. Now, one of the whole purposes of this Exodus narrative is to display to the pretenders, the pharaohs, the Egyptians, that God is God. We, as a presupposition, we might say, of this whole narrative is, we already know this because of our history with the patriarchs and so on. But no, not only the Egyptians to know it, we are to know it too. In this sense, we are in the same category as the Egyptians. The Egyptians need to learn that, but we need to learn it too. And that suggests that it's not obvious, never obvious, that God is God. It's always, this is what I like to say about it, which might seem to you a little bit blasphemous, that the claim that there is a God in the universe who has the attributes of the Bible's God, who redeems, who commands, who cares, who reaches down into the historical process and helps, that the Bible is daring to suggest that this is the nature of the universe against lots of contrary evidence. Isn't it true? I mean, Deuteronomy tries out the following idea. If you do the right thing, good things will happen to you. That's often not true. And if you do the wrong thing, bad things will happen to you. And that's often not true, right? There is the natural order, which works well for us most of the time, but not all of the time. We, in poetry, just read a pair of poems where Christopher Marlowe exalts the natural world as a place of comfort and solace and so on. And then Sir Walter Raleigh responds with a poem in which he says, no, the natural world doesn't always help us. And then we read William Carlos Williams, who even makes that point more strongly. So that if we're merely empiricists and draw our conclusions from the evidence that our senses give us, that there is a benign God in the world is a conjecture. So the Bible, I have always felt, is trying to make a case that its view of the universe is not only correct but felicitous. It's much better to live in a universe in which there is a God like the God of the Bible. Even though the God of the Bible also has some problematic qualities, right? God gets very angry. God abandons the people to the Babylonians. and so on and so on. So this story, I think, is an attempt to show not only the Egyptians, which would be very easy for a lesser author to do, the people in the white hats, the people in the black hats, the people before the first commercial, the people after the first commercial. But then it shows that we too need to come to believe just that claim, which is the major idea of these stories for the Egyptians, right? So the author is not satisfied with a strict binary opposition, that the author brings us into those who need to come to know this, as if a hidden premise is that it's hard to come to believe this, that there's a lot of contrary evidence. But evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, not only is this true, but it allows for a flourishing life. I think this is the challenge of the biblical narrative, that among the alternative ways of living, this is the best, or at least an extremely good way. And I'll be a little autobiographical about it. I have struggled with this issue myself. I mean, we go to the university and we learn the ologies: psychology, sociology, anthropology, and the ology suffix means the logic of, the thought about. So we're going to think about society. We're going to think about what it means to be human. We're going to think about the mind. And we're going to do it through scientific or rational categories. And having gone to the university, we might find it difficult to accept the hypothesis, this is how I put it, of the biblical author. But the heroism here is, just to repeat myself, that we are drawn into that problem, presupposing some resistance to the claim that there is a God in the universe who has the attributes of the biblical God. And of course we know how powerful an impact this idea has had on the lives of people around the world in different ways forever. So that I think the author is not only up to something very powerful in a simplistic way, there is this God, but the author complicates it by saying, and you know, the good guys need to learn this too. Maya?
On a different note, I think that whoever was the editor of the text came from a later time. So he says, you know, it's going to be taught, it's almost like the Haggadah, Vehigadeta lebanecha. So it just inserts a different perspective.
The perspective of education.
And also, things will resonate in the future. It's not only happening today.
I like
it's going
that.
to be.
Right. So Maya is making a very interesting point here. And I'll add another point that I think is implied. And that is, the author is not just telling the story, the author is reaching into the future and thinking of the obligation to tell this story to our children. And we know the Haggadah quotes the book of Exodus as well as the book of Deuteronomy very, very often. So, you know, the education imperative also suggests, let me put it this way. Let me define education, just off the top of my head. An attempt to tame our impulses, to get us to resist some of the things we might want to do in favor of the things that we ought to do. You know, Freud's last book, what was it? Civilization and Its Discontents. And the whole notion that the life of the impulses is going to get us into a lot of trouble. We need to tame them, to educate them, to sublimate them, to turn our passions toward productive ends. But that this civilizing impulse comes at a cost. Repression. That we not only tame our impulses, but oftentimes excessively, and create neuroses and psychoses and so on. And this is the cost of civilization and its discontents. And I want to suggest that education is the process by which we tame and sublimate, redirect our impulses. And that too suggests a privation in human nature, including the good guys, that we need to constantly be redirected, remind ourselves through the processes of education, language, ritual, music, and so on, to continue to try to steer our impulses. So even the education impulse, this is what I want to say, captures something that I was talking about in terms so that you may know. All of us have an inclination not to believe certain things that are good for us. And the education impulse is another method of trying to secure that. And here it's tell the story. The Bible is really narrative theology, we might say, and not doctrinal theology, even though there are some doctrines in there. And therefore, by telling the story and thinking of that story as our story, this is another way of coming to see and feel the power of the elements and the purposes of the story. So there's a reach, I like the point very much. The author has stepped back from telling this story to thinking about the future. This ought to be on your minds as the generations progress. Jim?
I find it interesting, for I have hardened the heart of the Pharaoh and the court and the whole thing. It's a little argument against free will, whereas Eve didn't have to do what the snake said.
No.
This tells you straight out,
Yeah.
I'm making Pharaoh do this.
Right.
So I'm setting him up to fail, but he has no choice.
Yep. So Jim has now raised another question. Notice we're still in verse 2. And that's the question of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which is a biblical conundrum. And Jim phrases it very well. If I have free will, then I am in charge of my own actions. If somebody forces me to do something, how can I be blamed for it? So what I want to do is read what Nahum Sarna has said about this, which I think is, to me, extremely compelling. Without a rubber band, this book doesn't have a chance. So this is in his book, Exploring Exodus, with the subtitle, The Heritage of Biblical Israel. I've mentioned Sarna over and over again. He's one of the great Bible scholars of our era. His son, Jonathan Sarna, is one of the great historians of American Judaism of our era. So here I'm on page 64. Let me just read what Sarna says. The motif of the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart occurs precisely 20 times in one form or another within the scope of the Exodus story between chapters 4 and 14. Intriguingly, Sarna says, the distribution of the motif is exactly equally divided between the Pharaoh and God as the direct cause of the hardening. 10 times it is said that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and 10 times the hardening is attributed to God. Furthermore, it is not until the advent of the 6th plague that divine intervention begins. That's to be distinguished from God's prediction that he will harden Pharaoh's heart that happens much earlier. Sarna is talking about when God actually comes to do the hardening and not just say he's going to. I'm going to read that again. Furthermore, it is not until the advent of the 6th plague that divine intervention begins. For the first 5 plagues, the Pharaoh's obduracy is the product of his own volition. This is crucial to the theological issue, for it stamps the king as a callous, evil-minded person who must bear full responsibility for his iniquitous acts, freely and knowingly perpetrated. You get the point? For the first 5 plagues in the narrative beforehand, Pharaoh is the cause of his own malevolence. The Pharaoh's culpability is established beyond doubt. He is not an innocent, blameless individual whose integrity is compromised and finally subverted by the intervention of providence, another name for God. He exhibits an obvious and willing predisposition to cruelty. Accordingly, the king's continued intransigence from the 6th plague on cannot be said to be involuntary, a point that is carefully made in the narrative by its twice stressing that the Pharaoh's obstinacy after the 7th plague was self-willed. He was not one to be constrained by moral principles, and he cannot be excused from criminal liability. In brief, the idea of God's hardening the Pharaoh's heart is that God utilizes a person's natural proclivity toward evil. He accentuates the process in furtherance of his own historical purposes. That's an interesting point here. I'll just read the first half of that sentence. In brief, the idea of God's hardening the Pharaoh's heart is that God utilizes a person's natural proclivities. There is one other point to be made in this connection. This is something we've already talked about this morning a bit. The theology and political theory of ancient Egypt stressed the literal divinity of the living Pharaoh. His will was law, his word was absolute. By reinforcing the Pharaoh's stubbornness, thereby making him a prisoner of his own irrationality, God deprives the God, in quotes, small g, God deprives the God of his freedom of action. The Pharaoh can no longer control his own will, and his so-called divinity is mocked. So I did give a Devar Torah a couple of weeks ago on this subject, and what I wanted to stress there was the role of habit in our lives. In a sense, habit reduces our free will. We reduce it ourselves. I know very well that when I come home from a late meeting at 8 o'clock or 8:30, I should not eat. And every now and then I'm able to turn left into the bedroom and not right into the kitchen. And as I'm turning right, I say to myself, don't do this. I mean, we know what it is like to eat late, right? You don't sleep very well. Well, I'm a victim of my own habits. Can I change? Yes, but it's hard. So that habituated action, I think this is one of the things that the text is talking about, that the Pharaoh, according to this interpretation, has developed a habit, a proclivity, which eventuates in actions, which is the result of his own actions. And this is the hardening of his heart by himself. Afterwards, halfway through the narrative, God adds God's own hardening, because this is also a contest between the God of the universe and the pretender God, so to speak. So that is Sarna's attempt to solve the problem of the hardening of the heart. You buy it? Seeing no objections. Okay, but it is intriguing, isn't it? I mean, who knew that there are 20 uses of that locution equally divided between two causal forces, God and Pharaoh? So Yeah, and don't you see, once again, I just want to underline this point, that one of the purposes of this whole narrative is the arrival at Mount Sinai and the commanding voice of God. There is a midrash which makes an analogy about a king who comes to a city and says, I want to be the king over you and I want you to obey me. And their answer is, why should we? So the king builds roads, he fixes the walls, he provides an economic policy that makes life better for people, after which he comes to them and says, I want to be king over you. And they say to him, of course, you have done wonderful things for us. By analogy, God says at Mount Sinai, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, to be your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not take my name in vain. Why should we? Go back and look at the story from chapter 1 of Exodus to chapter 19, by which it becomes crystal clear that we ought to obey the God who has been so wonderful to us. And one can universalize this idea that God not only redeemed us from Egypt, but God is a redeemer who redeems us from a variety of forms of bondage, social, personal, psychological, and so on. So the Bible is making a very big point out of this story, which I want to use a fancy word here, which is teleological. That is, it's got a purpose, it's got a goal. It's not just a powerful story in its own terms. It's providing the foundation for the right of God not only to be a liberating God, but a commanding God. And think about it in more general terms. I'm just repeating myself. That we're not just antiquarians in this sense. We're not just looking back into the past for the moment when God liberated us from Egypt. We're thinking of this as a kind of pattern of our lives down to the present. And if we read this story carefully and passionately, we might be able to infer that liberation, that freedom, is one of the things that is provided to us, is possible for us. I'm trying not to limit it to God doing it. For those who believe that this God exists, that would be a way of saying it. But I want to say something else, and that is that in our lives we have to reckon with the reality of the reality of the possibility of freedom, and work toward it, or to believe in the God who provides it. So this is the master story, not only of the Jewish people, but of human life, according to this author. Don't you think? That these are universal ideas. Candy?
Has anyone ever written a book analyzing God's behavior from the beginning of time until the present? Because it's obviously very different in biblical days than it is today. And you made reference to the fact of how relevant God needs to be in our lives. But yet, he doesn't talk to people directly in the same way. And times have changed, enormously, even though we still have leaders with hardened hearts.
Right.
It just would be interesting to analyze how God's known behavior has changed.
Right. Well, that's a huge question, isn't it? Karen Armstrong, I think, wrote a book on the history of God. What's his name? God, a Biography. Who is that again? Jack Miles. But there the biography is of the biblical God and not beyond. It's a matter of, shall I put this? I was going to say it's not a matter of reality, it's a matter of culture. That's not entirely true, but it's partially true. Culture and the premises of a given culture change. I mean, how did the Enlightenment come about, to oversimplify it? The religious wars of previous centuries and the superstitions which the Enlightenment individuals thought they found in traditional religion, certain individuals were fed up with this and tried to find another way. Coupled with some major scientific discoveries of, Huygens and Galileo and Newton and Kepler and so on, which showed that there was another way of accessing, of understanding the universe. And that is through reason and through the evidence of our senses, experimentation. And the hope was, after all, the very word enlightenment, to name the Aufklärung in German, was an attempt to name the cultural emphases of that time. What is that? That's a loaded word, isn't it? We are now bringing light to society. And through that light, we can solve the problems that have always bedeviled humanity. The Enlightenment was a messianic movement. It was an attempt to finally solve the problems that were exacerbated by the previous culture. The Dark Ages. Anybody living in the Dark Ages look out at the world and say, God, we are in the Dark Ages. Why? No. This was a polemic against the previous culture. To call it the Dark Ages, for which the Enlightenment is an antidote. And the promise, one of the outcomes of the results of the Enlightenment was the emancipation of the Jews in France and then in Germany and Italy and so on, bringing the Enlightenment of humanism to the world and liberating those who have been compromised by previous cultures. Of course, Theodor Herzl makes a claim at the end of the 19th century, 100 years after the French Revolution, that it didn't work. They really don't want us, and therefore we're going to have to take ourselves out of Europe to a land where we're not subject to that anti-Semitism. What am I driving at here? So that the Enlightenment has certain premises that reason can solve our problems. And 100 years later, we have the Moroccan crises, we have the Russo-Japanese War early in the 20th century, we have World War I, which decimated European society. Is this what the Enlightenment produces? Killing machines of rare power in order to decimate humanity across a continent? Maybe reason isn't what all it's cracked up to be. And maybe we need to return to things like religion, faith, in a different way. So it's not so much the history of God, but the history of thinking about God and God's place in society. Who was it who said, I think it may have been Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who said the history of philosophy is the history of error. Plato says X, Aristotle says, no, it's not X, it's Y. The skeptics come and say, no, it's not what Aristotle said, it's something else. And then we've got religious philosophy, and then we have the empiricists out of England, always saying that the previous philosophers were wrong. So that error, to put it this way, is a part of the succession of cultures. A subsequent culture is trying to solve the problems that a previous culture created. Something like that. So, Candy, your question needs to be dealt with in terms of finding a way to evaluate comparatively different ways of leading a life, different cultures. And of course, we never get to the bottom of that because it depends upon your premises. And yeah, please.
So, why did we get to know when God was commanding Pharaoh to do something? Pharaoh had no clue when he was acting on his own accord, and when God was commanding him, but we are privy to that. Why?
Well, I think the author is trying to tell us the meaning of this story, and that Pharaoh is initially his own person, and as he begins to develop this habit, something else becomes a cause of the action. So this is an interpretation. I mean, if you read the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus to Pharaoh, let's suppose we could get Pharaoh back. I think he would be astonished at how we understand that story. That's not how he understood it. Think of the Babylonian exile. So the Israelites finally go into exile in Babylonia. The Babylonians are defeated by the Assyrians in something like 550 before the Common Era, and King Cyrus the Great, ascends the throne. And he has a very different policy about how to treat exiles. The Babylonians' policy was to bring them out of their land, but allow them to maintain their social coherence. In that sense, the Babylonians saved the Israelites. King Cyrus's view was, you don't take the people out of the land, you let them go back to their land as long as they pledge fealty to the crown and can serve as a buffer against other foreign powers. And the prophet Isaiah says that God called Cyrus to do this. Now, let's suppose we could bring Cyrus back, and we say to him, this is how we understand the story, that God told you to do this. Now, what would Cyrus's response have been? Are you kidding me? I wasn't a puppet of your God. I was dealing with geopolitical realities. I had an expanding empire. Egypt is on the rise again. Let the Israelites go back to serve as a loyal to me because I liberated them, buffer. So the stories that one people tells about their interactions with other peoples are not likely to resonate if they get to be very abstract, and that God did this, abstract in the sense of a larger causal factor. So I think that's it. Amy, and then we'll go back to the story and then come back to some conversation.
Is the story also a conversation of actions in and through time, that some actions will deliver immediate consequences, but there are other actions that we as a people can't yet know and will play out in future generations?
Can you give an example of that? Is this story an example of that?
The Pharaoh, the immediate, I will not let you go, and then there's the action of a plague. But then the Jews have to wander in the desert for 40 years.
Yes.
Before there is a reward for the action of following Moses and God.
I see what you're saying.
Does that make it?
You're not talking about coming to understand the story later, but playing out the implications of the story over time.
Right, that there are some deeds, to answer your earlier black and white question. If you do good, you're rewarded with good, but if you do evil, bad things will happen. Knowing that that's not always the case, but if you lay out the timeline saying, God is not knowable, and we as a people have to take a leap of faith and act after an action, be willing to accept that in our generation, we may not see the promised land.
That's an interesting point, that a story, or let's call it even a hypothesis, can't be fully understood until it's allowed to play out. Is that your idea here?
And that the author is trying to demonstrate that.
By subsequent events. By subsequent events. It's not until we get to the promised land and can really have a life of our own as a people that we see the larger implications of these earlier stories. Is that part of what you have in mind? Yeah, that's an interesting point. Right. Yeah. I mean, it figures also, let's say, in mathematics or science. I mean, Euclid had a parallel postulate that parallel lines never meet until infinity. Well, what's the power of that idea? We don't know until we develop the system, Euclidean geometry, based upon hypotheses like that. That's another example of what you're talking about, isn't it? Yeah, right.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what I would have said, of course.
Yeah. By the way, just as a big aside, so some of you, I just got the Beechwood buzz yesterday, and Amy and Armand are featured in this edition of it. A long, long story. I haven't gotten to the end of it, so I'm curious as to how it turns out. But congratulations, it's a beautiful story and lovely, lovely pictures.
I never thought I'd be a centerfold.
Okay. All right, so let's go back. Let's read a little bit more, and then we'll continue our discussion. So here we are. We've made a lot of progress here. We're on verse 3. So I'm just being sarcastic. I hope you know that. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may worship me. For if you refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I will bring locusts on your country." So this is, I believe, the 8th. In this portion, we have the last 3 plagues. They shall cover the surface of the land so no one will be able to see the land. They shall devour the surviving remnant that was left to you after the hail. And they shall eat away all your trees that grow in the field. Moreover, they shall fill your palaces and the houses of all your courtiers and all the Egyptians, something that neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers had seen from the day they appeared on earth to this day. This is another illustration of Maya's point about time. Here, it puts this event in the context of history. Now, they make this claim. I mean, how do they know that's the case? That there was never anything like the locust plague. They're just trying to talk about the uniqueness of this event. With that, he turned and left Pharaoh's presence. Pharaoh's courtiers said to him, "How long shall this one be a snare to us?" See, the courtiers, the assistants, are weakening. "Let the men go to worship the Lord their God. Are you not yet aware that Egypt is lost?" So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go worship the Lord your God. Who are the ones to go?" And Moses replied, "We will all go, young and old. We will go with our sons and our daughters, our flocks and herds, for we must observe the Lord's festival." I've always felt that this response is deliberately provocative. I mean, really, you have to go out to the wherever and worship God. You need to bring all your cattle? So Moses seems to be suggesting to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gets the point, this is the Exodus. Now we're going to leave. But he said to them, "The Lord be with you, the same as I mean to let your children go with you." It's a nice example of biblical sarcasm. Right? "May the Lord be with you the same as I mean to let your children go with you." Namely, I don't mean to let your children go with you, so I'm hoping that God will not be with you. See the sarcasm there? "Clearly you are bent on mischief. No, you menfolk go and worship the Lord, since that is what you want." And they were expelled from Pharaoh's presence. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat up all the grasses in the land, whenever the hail is left." So Moses held out his rod over the land of Egypt, a very nice foreshadowing of what happens at the Red Sea. when God says to Moses, hold out your hand. So here is not only a parallel or an anticipation, but it also raises a very interesting point that, yes, God does miracles, but Moses has a role in the doing of the miracle. For what reason? Well, let's just look ahead for a minute at the end of chapter 14. Chapter 14, verse 30, which is really the climactic verses of these first 14 chapters. Because at the end of 14, we have the Exodus, and then in chapter 15, we sing the Song of the Sea, who was like you among the Lord. So verses 30 and 31 are the climax of the climax. Thus the Lord delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. So the faith they have also in Moses has to, of course, be illustrated by things Moses does. And Moses is quite active in this story. But the acme of his activity is serving as a, what's the word here, an assistant to a complement to God's miracles. Hold out your hand. In other words, so that this miracle will happen. The claim is not, I don't think, maybe it is, that Moses does the miracles, but God, or the author, let me put it this way and see if you accept this. The author is trying very hard to steer a mid-course between two extremes. One extreme, Moses plays no role in this at all. It's God's story. The other extreme is everything that God allegedly does is also done by Moses, that Moses is a big miracle worker himself. The two extremes are Moses does nothing, Moses does everything. Neither can work. Moses, who is leading the people, has to also have his authority cultivated and developed, right? But you can't, on the other hand, cultivate it to such a degree that Moses becomes on the same level as God. So Moses has to be doing some big things, but not in order to put God in the shadows. And holding his hand out to help God is a mid-course activity, because not only is God's authority at stake, so is Moses's, right? What do we call the Bible, the origin of the Bible? It has at least two. Torah min ha-shamayim. Shamayim is heaven, but now it's a euphemism for, or another word for God. The Torah comes from God, but it's also Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses, which Moses delivers to us. So once again, Moses' role, Maimonides calls Moses the greatest philosopher, legislator who ever lived. Moses knew the truth. He spoke with God mouth to mouth, or he spoke God's word mouth to mouth, something like that. So to have Moses raise his hand, I think, is a stroke of great insight into what we want to infer from this story, looking at Amy's point about longer range implications of a seemingly innocent action. Okay, so now we're back here. Verse 13 of chapter 10. So Moses held out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord drove an east wind over the land all that day and night. And when morning came, the east wind had brought the locusts. Locusts invaded all the land of Egypt and settled within all the territory of Egypt in a thick mass. Never before, see, here's now a reach into temporality. The present in conjunction with the past and the future. Never before. This is singular. Up to now, singular. We don't know the future. All we know is up to now. It never happened before. Nor will there ever be so many again. Now, how does the author know this? How can you, when he says, when the Torah says at the very end of Deuteronomy, there never again will arise a prophet like Moses. That is a doctrinal statement. That's not an empirical statement. How does the author know what the future is? And the same thing here. This is a miracle of unique stupendousness. And therefore, it all the more elevates the not only the power of God, but the presence of God in the life of a people. So I guess I'm trying to make a case here, and I don't think it's too hard to make, that this story is both, on the surface, quite magnificent. It's an epic. But it also, in many ways, is quite subtle, too, in terms of what it is driving at. We, not only the Egyptians should know, we should know. That's the subtlety we looked at the beginning. Moses' role, poised between two extremes. We've got to elevate the leader without diminishing God's uniqueness. So verse 15, they hid all the land from view, and the land was darkened, and they ate up all the grass of the field, and the fruit of the trees which they had was left, so that nothing green was left of tree or grass of the field in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I stand guilty before the Lord your God. See, Pharaoh is on the way of being vanquished, defeated. But it's not a smooth line. I mean, he retracts and so on. Verse 17, forgive my offense just this once and plead with the Lord your God that he but remove this death from me. So he left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with the Lord. The Lord, see, this is Moses as intercessor, right, on behalf of the people to God. And ironically, Moses is now placed in the position of appealing to God on behalf of the Pharaoh. So, verse 18 again. He left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with the Lord. The Lord caused a shift to a very strong west wind. In other words, Moses is not only intercessor, but God allows himself to be interceded. Right? God allows the pleas of the P-L-E-A-S, of the people, allows himself to respond to them. God is not just acting out of his own ideas. God is also in communication, in, let's say, partnership or covenant, to use a big word. This may not be what it is right here. God allows himself to be moved. Passive voice. He doesn't just move himself. He allows himself to be moved. Remember what Heschel said? God is not the unmoved mover. That's the idea of Aristotle. He's the most moved mover. That God deals in a realm of pathos, of feeling, and God feels as well. The Lord, verse 19, caused a shift to a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and hurled them into the sea of reeds. Not a single locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. Boy, this is really a miracle. The most locusts that ever have been or ever will be, covering the whole land, darkening it all. And you know, how long is it going to take once the locusts stop multiplying to get rid of them? It's going to take months. No. God brings a wind, gets rid of all of them, just like that. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. So that's a powerful moment, isn't it? Pharaoh is relenting. He's ready. But God is not going to allow him to relent too quickly. Because God wants to make certain, or let's put it this way, the author wants to make it certain that God is the prime mover of this story. And this is where a bit of cruelty to Pharaoh might be seen as seeping in, right? Pharaoh is ready, but God isn't. Then verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days no one could get up from where he was, but all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwelling. I think this is the first time when the Israelites are not caught up in the effects of the plagues. Now God is making a distinction. And let's imagine that we're there and we can see, we're standing at the top of a hill. And let's just imagine, over here are the Egyptians and over here are the Israelites. We can see both. And we have a natural occurrence here, a deep, dark fog. But at some point, it stops, and the Israelites have light. So here God is interceding on behalf of the Israelites to make the impact even more powerful. Maya?
I read a very interesting commentary, and if you go back to number 10,
Verse 10? Mm-hmm.
verse 10, it says, Re'u ki ra'a neged pnechem. So the argument was, and I found it compelling, that at that time the Egyptians were worshipping Amun-Ra, who is the sun god. And the Ra is maybe derived from there. And then it's kind of interesting because if you follow the argument, it says, that God is taking away the sun. And so it implies that actually it's not only between Pharaoh and Jehovah, but it's between the sun god of the Egyptians versus God, and God has the upper hand.
I like that very much. You can see what Maya is pointing to, that this is an argument not only against the human ruler, but against divine rulers according to Egyptian theology. To be able to bring darkness when it should be light, what's that? What is that vanquishing? The sun. Yeah. A sun god. Yeah, very good, thanks. Verse 24. Pharaoh then summoned Moses and said, go worship the Lord, only your flocks and your herds shall be left behind. So Pharaoh is still trying to, what is he trying to do here? He's trying to undermine the obvious attempt of the Israelites to leave, period. Leave your animals here, you're going to have to come back. I'm already agreeing that you can go worship your God, but we can't afford an exodus. We need to labor. Only your flocks and your herds shall be left behind. Even your children may go with you. But Moses said, you yourself must provide us with the sacrifices. Again, deliberately provocative. Go and sacrifice. No, you got to give us the money to do it. You yourself must provide us with sacrifice and burnt offerings to offer up to the Lord our God. Our own livestock too shall go along with us. Not a hoof shall remain behind, for we must select from it for the worship of the Lord our God, and we shall not know with what we are to worship the Lord until we get there. Should be pretty obvious to Pharaoh what they're up to. But the Lord stiffened. See, at this point, the text says, but the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, as if Pharaoh might be softening here. It's just a little ways from maybe giving the whole thing to them. But at this point, God intercedes. The Lord stiffens Pharaoh's heart, and he would not agree to let them go. Pharaoh said to him, be gone from me, and take care not to see me again. For the moment you look upon my face, you shall die. And Moses replied, you have spoken rightly. I shall not see your face again. So this heightens the conflict, doesn't it? And leads to the climactic act of the last plague. And the Lord said to Moses, chapter 11, I'll bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that he shall let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. Tell the people to borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. And the Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, which has always seemed to me a little bit unfair. As if the people were not predisposed to help. But is that realistic? I mean, let's suppose the story is historical. Well, we can infer that the people were living among the Egyptians. And don't you think there would have been friendships and caring about one another? You're living within another society. But this suggests here that the people, not only was Pharaoh, but up and down the population, there was hostility from everybody, which then necessitated, verse 3, the Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably as if they weren't on their own. So, I mean, doesn't this heighten the mythic quality of this story? Mythic now in the sense of large categories, not subject to particular concerns about elements of the story. You get everybody that did not like the Israelites. And by the way, there is another moment of dialectic later. I'm just going to find it here. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, you don't have to go there with me. This is chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, verse 8. You shall not abhor an Edomite. Edom is Esau, the brother of Jacob. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. And in Hebrew, the word kinsman is achicha, your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land. That's a remarkable comment, isn't it? Over and against the tendency of this whole Exodus story. Not that the Egyptians were persecutors, but that they were hosts. They were hospitable for all those years. So this is an attempt, I think, I don't know, am I right about this or am I overstating it? An attempt of a later author. Amy, this in a way is an example of your point, though in an unexpected way. Yeah, the Egyptians were persecutors, but maybe we ought to also see them as hospitable in order to soften the negativity of the image of the Egyptians. So the author is reaching for another feature of this story, which the author of the epic can't afford to be involved in. Ambiguity. Who are the Egyptians? Oh, they're terrible from top to bottom. Well, maybe all those years they offered hospitality to the people. The end of the 23rd Psalm, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the climax of the 23rd Psalm, that God is asking us to move into God's house forever. So, I mean, I think this illustrates the high value accorded to the notion of hospitality in all ancient cultures. Right, all ancient cultures. And so the later biblical author is trying to reach for a little of that other side, which I have always found very moving. Stuart?
Abraham with the three strangers who were angels.
Yeah. Hospitality.
Yeah.
You're right.
And currently, Arab society views a stranger as a good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can't help but think of Wagner's Ring Cycle, where Sigmund at the beginning of Die Valkyrie is fleeing from Hunding, and he comes to Hunding's house. And Hunding recognizes him as the enemy, but says, I've got to be hospitable to you tonight. Stay the night, but tomorrow I'm going to go after you. Right? right. Or you remember Priam and Achilles' tent at the end of the Iliad, when he comes into the heart of the enemy and has to be treated with deference and so on. So hospitality is a main value in the ancient world. Jim?
But the situation is like that in almost every war. The ruler and the military have to listen to him, but the populace, they have no interest in this war.
Okay, very
For the
good.
most part, it's going on right this minute in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't think the average Russian wants a war.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. So that not only is the author here trying to create some ambiguity, but this is the nature of things. The wars are the decisions of the elite that put the populace into danger. And they're not interested in that. No, I like that thought. So we're back to chapter 11, verse 3. And the Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Where am I? Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people. That's a lovely claim, isn't it? Moses walking down the street and the Egyptian people are saying, there goes Moses, what a guy. Moses said, verse 4, thus says the Lord, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who was behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Israel and Egypt. So there it is in a very, very clear way. Then all the courtiers of the earth shall come down to me and bow low to me, saying, depart, you and all the people who follow you. After that I will depart. And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. Now the Lord had said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you in order that my marvels may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So, here's something we've faced many, many times in the past. So, what it appears to be is that God is egotistical. He wants to be exalted as the master of miracles. And what kind of a God is that? That wants something for himself. Any thoughts about that? Is that what this means, Kathy?
Are we seeing the influence of ancient Greek literature? So we have a sun god, we have a pharaoh, we have the armies and the people. On the other side, we have Jehovah, Moses, and his people. And the gods are playing out their scenarios using their human leaders, and then the people pay the price in the midst of all this. Isn't this a story that's told over and over and over again? It's actually about, as Maya talked about this, it's actually about the battle of the gods in the end. Not the people. It's not the people's story, it's the gods and who will triumph as the god. And then the triumphing God, then the people get to have power and freedom and liberation only because their God won, not by their virtue of their own qualities of humanity.
Well, I didn't sleep long enough last night. That's a big question in so many ways. One is just whether or not the authors knew something about Greek literature. You know, the Philistines arrive in Canaan just at the time that the Trojan War is over. Trojan War is over like something like 1170, 1180. And that's, according to scholars, when we had migrations from the Aegean region into the land of Canaan, the Philistines. And if that's true, then it's possible that the Philistines from the Aegean region, from the Greek region, brought elements of Greek culture. But I still think, and I haven't read anything about this in a long, long time. I don't know what the current thinking is. So it's possible that there is an impact of Greek literature and thought on the Bible. Yeah, I wish I knew more about it. The other thing to say, though, is this story is a type of story. It's a matter of the gods interacting with, in some way or another, human beings. So if it's a type of story, then it's possible to say that it has its own origin and isn't borrowing from another culture's story, right? If we get Goethe's Faust, well, we know there's a whole tradition of stories about Faust, and we know that Goethe had to have known those stories and had his own origin. Here, I don't think we need to go that far because this is a kind of story about people and their gods. Then there's the question of forget the causal relationship, the historical relationship, just think of the kind of story it is. The Greek gods don't give a hoot about human beings. They're using them for their own purposes. Here we have a God who cares. And God has no friends in heaven. There's only one of God. There's not a battle among the gods. Although this story is mythic in that sense. It's a contest between God and a pretender. So I think that the Bible is introducing something that the Greek view is much more pessimistic, I think. That there are all kinds of problems in life. The gods don't care about us. We're playthings of the gods. Whereas the Bible has introduced a God who cares and who reaches down from God's onlyness to intercede on behalf of human beings. That's a big difference, isn't it?
But he only intercedes to his people. Don't we have to wait all the way into a more modern era where we see Christianity coming and saying that the one God has triumphed. Now all peoples receive the benefices, is that the right word, of that God. So suddenly this is the God of the Egyptians, the God of the Israelites, and we have this modern era where it's not them against us, that we are all part of becoming this one group.
Yeah, gosh. So let me just make a couple of responses to the challenging question. God is first and foremost a universalist. The Bible doesn't start where, if I were writing a Bible, where I would start would be with Abraham. It's the story of Abraham and his and Sarah's descendants. So let me get to the story. No, there are the first 11 chapters of the Bible, which are all about God and humanity. There are no Israelites. So that God's main interest, not only we might say, I think it is the case, is in establishing a relationship with human beings. And he tries it in at least 4 ways in those early chapters, right? Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Babylonites. And they all run aground. So God, here's what I would want to say. No, the Bible says it too. God steps back and says, I can't accomplish my goal directly. I have to accomplish it indirectly. Indirectly is, I'm going to try to have this relationship with all human beings. And I'm interested in all human beings. I'm the God of everybody. But now I see I can't do it directly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose an instrument for doing it. The Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your native land, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. So God does not cease to be a universalist. He has just found another means to that end. And the means now becomes the massive story of the Bible, which God never relinquishes. I'm going to quote the prophet Amos, chapter 9. To me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians. True, I brought Israel up from Egypt, but also the Philistines from Kaphtor, and the Arameans from Kir. Don't think that you're the only one that had an exodus where I reached down and took you out. You might think that because the story is about you. But look, I have a larger plan. I've brought other peoples up from captivity. I mean, that is a remarkable claim, isn't it? We can tell our own story and think, this is the only story there is. And if we have God at the head of the story, then the only God favors only us. That leads to the notion of the chosen people. I have two views about the chosen people idea. First, it's very problematic. Second, that idea saved us for 2,000 years. If we didn't believe that we were the chosen people in 11th century Bologna, 12th century Mainz, 13th century Poland, 14th century Bologna, if we didn't believe that we were the chosen people, we would have gone over to the other side. Because I want to put it this way, we're the losers on the front pages of the newspaper. The news of the day was for 2,000 years not very favorable to us. We had to believe that we were still special to God in order to be able to hold the fort against all this persecution, exile, resistance. So the chosen people was an astonishingly productive idea to save the Jews. I'm not saying that was the motivation of the idea, but that's one of its uses, even though it can be seen as very problematic. Mordecai Kaplan, who created Reconstructionist Judaism, right? Out of the Jewish Theological Seminary, it comes from conservative Judaism. By Reconstruction, he meant we have to reinterpret all the language of Judaism so that God is no longer the miracle worker who comes down from heaven, but he is the power that makes for salvation. And Kaplan reconstructs all the language of Judaism except for the notion of the chosen people, which he thought was too problematic even to be subject to reinterpretation. So he has this idea of an orchestra. But the principal clarinet is the chosen clarinetist. It's true. But not the chosen musician. The violist is chosen. The timpanist is chosen. The orchestra is filled with those chosen for their vocation. And there's not just one chosen musician. So this is Kaplan's kind of bow to pluralism. We can still have the idea of special gifts and so on. Yeah. Where am I going with this? So look, I mean, I think back to the notion of God caring for one people. I think we need to see it not as for the Bible an end in itself, which it also is. God cares about this people. But as an instrument for a universal ambition that God never relinquishes. And Amos has to tell the people Look, don't be so self-satisfied. God has done this, just this big paradigm activity. God has done Exodus for other peoples as well. Let me just read from chapter 3 of Amos. Hear this word, O people Israel, that the Lord has spoken concerning you, concerning the whole family that I brought up from the land of Egypt. You alone have I singled out, chosen people, of all the families of the earth. That's why I will call you to account for all your iniquities. I didn't choose you for special glory. I chose you for special obligation. And if you get it right, hooray. If you don't, there's going to be trouble. Because you're the ones that I've called to be moral people, and this is a great burden. I chose you for burden. So Amos is trying to reconfigure. That's not the right word. He is, let's put it this way. He's demythologizing the notion of the chosen people. And he's trying to make it much more complicated than we might infer. So it wasn't Christianity that brought the notion of universalism into the world. For all I know, it wasn't even the Hebrew Bible. But certainly the Hebrew Bible gets it, even though it can be obscured. Doris?
What do you think of Kaplan's idea?
Of the pluralism?
Yeah, of the clarinet, one part of that whole thing.
What do I think about it? I'm in a certain way stuck on the biblical idea of the chosen people. I feel its power. I don't adhere to it personally. I don't think that Judaism is the best religion, or that the Jewish people are the best people. Judah Halevi, this medieval Jewish philosopher, has this notion of the chosen people as somehow biological. That's how far he takes it. We have an inner impulse as Jews that allow us to be prophets. I don't buy that at all. I like Kierkegaard's idea of the difference between objective certainty and subjective certainty. Objective certainty is, I'm certain about something and it's true. Subjective certainty is, I believe something and it's true for me. I love baseball. You don't. You love football. I'm not going to watch all those games tomorrow, even though I'm interested. But because I love baseball and football less so and hockey even less than that, doesn't mean I want to say that baseball is the greatest game. It's just the greatest game for me. No, I would want to say it's the greatest game. Yeah, so I like that notion that, yes, I feel chosen to be Jewish, which is a great way to live a life with endless possibility for sanctification. But there are other ways of doing it too. I think Kierkegaard's notion of subjective certainty, not just subjectivity, I choose, but I choose because I'm certain in some way or another, but only for me. What could be a better way of living a life in a pluralistic society? I mean, if we were living in a ghetto, I probably wouldn't love the Polish people because I'm under pressure constantly. Amy?
As we're talking about going down the path of being the chosen people and being a light unto the nations, and in Egypt, when the Jews were the ones who had the lights, was that the first time that idea that we of light being connected with Jews?
Light unto the nations, that idea?
Right.
That idea?
But then I just Googled it and it was so interesting. All the connections of Bible and light, first things that came up were Jesus.
Oh.
So it's just interesting to see.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly I don't want to diminish the power of Christianity, which is one of the great religions. I mean, it doesn't last for 2,000 years unless it's got something really amazing to say. But the light, I mean, look, let me quickly go to Isaiah just to illustrate the point.
I cited Judaism and life, and then Isaiah came up.
That's what I was going to read. I thought you said Jesus. Did you say Jesus?
No, Isaiah, when I typed in Judaism and being a light unto the nation.
Yes.
Then Isaiah came up.
Oh, then Isaiah came up. Right.
I just kept it general. It was all Jesus related and New Testament.
I'm not sure you're saying that they're quoting Isaiah as in anticipation of Jesus, that all this leads to Jesus? No.
No, I was just assuming when you were talking in the Exodus that the plague of darkness.
Yes.
And the Jews' homes remained lit.
Right.
And I was thinking, that was the source going forward perhaps, that will be a light unto other nations.
I see what you're saying.
And that there was a through line there I was playing with. And so I wanted to see where in the Old Testament that line first appeared. And when
I see what you're saying. Light as now a light unto the nation, a light that we use.
And that was part of why we are the chosen people.
Ah.
Our role to be a light unto other nations.
Right. And that's right. That's what Isaiah says. Where does he say it? Come, chapter 2 of Isaiah. Let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and that we may walk in his paths, and so on. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk by the light of the Lord. Yeah, no, I think you're tracing it. I think that's right, except I don't think that the Egyptian example of lighting in the houses has anything to do with light unto the nations. It's light and light, but I think light is used very differently, unless I misunderstand what you're driving at. Do I?
I just wondered whether it was a precursor, it was, again, going through time.
Right.
The Jews' role as lighting a way and differentiating us from others.
Yeah. I kind of have a sarcastic image in my head. I'll say it. This is not directed at you. In the Middle Ages, I could imagine one person saying to another, let's go to the ball tonight. And they get dressed up and they go to the ball. That's a precursor of baseball. My God, is that where throw the ball comes from? That would be, right, in a way, the same word, but in totally different, and so on, and so on. That was sarcastic. Where the heck are we? I have no idea.
Are the chosen people. And I think what you said earlier about your witnessing to that personally is extraordinary. What you're talking about right now, as the chosen people, I reckon, how can you not be the chosen people?
What do you mean by chosen people? Seriously though, is it chosen for a particular task? Chico Carrasquel was chosen to be the shortstop. That doesn't mean he is the chosen baseball player, period. He was chosen for this particular task.
Well, you are chosen to be precisely the light for everybody.
Uh-huh.
And as a Christian, I turn to you all as the leaders of the path to God. Why do people always want to put out our light?
I would not adhere to that idea myself. I think there are many peoples chosen to do what the Jewish people was also chosen to do, not uniquely.
But you are the first. Yes, you are.
Yeah, but chronological priority is not logical priority. If coming first doesn't matter really in terms of mission or task, right? Coming first. Abraham came first. That's irrelevant as to what Abraham represents. Not just the first in time, but the first in recognizing a certain set of values, if that's the case. He's a paradigm, which I think is much more important than time. No, I'm pretty committed to the notion that there are lots of chosen people. We're all chosen to do something in the world, is the way I want to put it. Ron?
Doris brings to mind the legend of the last of the just.
Okay.
That, I'll summarize my understanding, that into each generation there is born a person who will absorb all of the suffering of mankind. He is the last of the just people. It goes on generation for generation for generation.
In each generation.
Right.
Okay.
In that regard,
Yeah.
it would seem that we are chosen for that purpose, to maintain against all odds justice.
Yeah. So I would say there are two things to say about what you've just said. One is, which I like myself, that we Jews have obligations, and we're called to live a certain kind of life. The possible implication, other implication is, in some ways we are not just an empirical, historical people living in and through history. We're a mythic people. We stand above history with a certain special project of our own. Now, to be a mythic people can yield very positive ideas and very negative ideas. If we're Christ killers, then this is a mythicization of the Jewish people who carry this special attribute down through history. Whether or not a given individual or a given people in time has any complicity in that idea. So the notion of special mission, with which I agree, but not singular. My obligation is to be the best Jewish person I can be. And one of the ways I do it is to revel in all the non-Jewish things that life has to offer me, because I think that we Jews are particularists and universalists. That's why we bring Apollo's fire here. That's why we have Beethoven quartets here, because we Jews are caught up not only in Judaism, but in life. But once one says called for something trans-historical, I think, not only do I think that's excessive, but I think it's dangerous. Myself. I feel called to live a certain life, don't you? And I don't think about it. In this room, I'm a person who is called to live a certain life, like you. I'm no different from you. I know this is not the point here, but I see myself in a way, the way I see peoples. Judaism is to peoples as rabbis are to Jews. Each of us as a Jew is called to live an exemplary life. I'm struggling with doing that the way you are. And Jews are struggling with it the way all peoples are. I mean, when I was playing baseball, I tried to be the best baseball person I could be. Not the best athlete, just the best of what I was doing. I don't know. What do you think about this? Okay. The camera's going to shut off shortly. So, stuff to think about. I mean, and the Exodus story really points to these questions, doesn't it? Because here God is reaching down into history and favoring one people over and against another people. And that can certainly lead to the notion of the uniqueness of the Jewish people. But the later prophets try to qualify that a little bit, don't they? That I brought the Arameans up from Kaftor. You're not the only one who I reached down and had an Exodus. I don't know what the Kaftorites have as a Seder, but the Arameans. Malcolm, and then we'll stop.
One of the questions that this conversation raises for me is, if we are chosen, were chosen by God, what was God's motive in choosing us?
Well, I think the motive is pretty clear. He wanted to be reconciled with all the peoples of the earth and called us as an instrument for God's universalizing reconciliation.
So then we are chosen for a purpose.
Exactly, right. But notice that it would, for the prophets at least, it would be wrong to infer from the fact that we were chosen for a purpose that we are the only ones chosen for that purpose. And the prophets try to tell us we're among those chosen for that purpose. Yes, and it's very easy to slip into the uniqueness claim, which I try very hard never. Faithful Christians, faithful Muslims, faithful Buddhists, they're no better than we are, or worse. We're all trying in our own language, in our own culture. What more is there to say? I mean, no, that's not true. Yes.
This is a quick question. Is that Reform Judaism speaking?
Is that Reform Judaism?
Or, would Orthodox Jews say the same thing?
No.
Probably not. It depends. For example, the motto of the Yeshiva University, which is the ordaining institution of Orthodox Judaism, is Torah Umada, Torah and science. So even they are putting Judaism in the context of a larger language. But they would go much further than we do. Because what is Reform Judaism? I mean, look, you think of the continuum. All modern Jews have two things they're trying to balance: being Jewish and being moderns, or in the modern world. Reform Judaism has made more concessions to modernity. Conservative Judaism less, Orthodox Judaism less. There's a difference between traditional Judaism and modern Orthodox Judaism, because precisely they're trying to balance modernity and Judaism. Now, there are the extreme Orthodox, and by extreme, I'm not making a value judgment, which try to be only. But when they go out into Manhattan to run their stores, inevitably the modern world is going to seep into their consciousness. So you have to barricade yourself off entirely, which they do, I think, more than we do, that's for sure. So, You know, where there was a famous rabbi in the early 19th century, what was his name? The Khatam Sofer, I think it was, who said that all reform is blasphemy. I think he was wrong. I mean, the interpreters from the very beginning are interpreting. Look, Amos is already, if I could say it this way, and then he interprets the Exodus story. When he says there are others who had their Exodus, what's he saying? This is a perush, an interpretation of. So we can't get away without interpretation. I was just reading a piece on originalism in terms of constitutional law. And the article's title was, Originalism is a Charade. You can't bring an ancient document into the modern world and think that you understand what it meant then. Original meaning. Whose meaning? Who said so? And so on. So interpretation is inevitable, and we do it in our different ways. Well, Shabbat Shalom. See you next week, if not sooner. Don't forget Rabbi Dadoon.
But you're going to like this one. This morning, you had nothing but fast pitches.
Oh, you're nice to say.
No, and I had no questions because
I felt I swung and missed a couple of times.
I don't think so. I can't believe what you brought in. No, that's, okay. Anyway, I just wanted to give you that.
Yeah, it wasn't, Kafka's amazing, isn't he?
Yeah.
And the discussion we had.
We did, and you saw my little note about dearest fatherland. Did you see that? Oh, maybe I'll resend it. I sent it to Joyce on Monday. It may have been, I must resend it again. Well, I don't know what it is right now. It's been mind-blowing. But when you start to read that Kafka's letter to his father, dearest father,
Dearest.
I heard that as starting off as satire. Starting off as satire rather than self-affliction or self